Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really glad for your interest in reproductive justice. This was a framework that was created by 12 black women in 1994, June of 1994, and we did it for two reasons. Hillary Clinton, who was then the First Lady, was in the process of doing health care reform, and the centrist Democrats at the time thought that if they omitted reproductive health care from their proposal, that they could slide it by the recalcitrant Republicans. We 12 black women saw this and had our WTF moment, like, reproductive health care is the main reason women go to doctors. So how can we be supportive of a male-centric revision of health care? We just can't. And so we were also coming from different organizations, but we were both pro-choice and pro-life. Some of us were pro-choice, some of us were pro-life. So abortion wasn't our glue. It wasn't the issue that we came together on. It was really about reforming this proposed policy. And in our negotiations that evening, we decided to splice together the concept of reproductive rights with social justice, because we believe that everybody needs social justice and the human right to have their needs taken care of. And we created the concept of reproductive justice, that portmanteau that held what we were talking about. And so, much to our surprise, that creation that we did in 1994 went viral. Within 10 years, most women of color were using reproductive justice as a human rights-based way to talk about what they needed from health care. And then within 20 years, it had penetrated the mainstream, so that the major organizations like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, now the Feminist Majority, were now rebranding themselves as reproductive justice sympathetic or actual reproductive justice organization. So it became an example of an idea that started on the margins of black feminist activism, that, like intersectionality, moved to the mainstream and started having an impact on the mainstream. But it's also, like intersectionality, is being co-opted without being attributed. And so we who are in its origin and defense say reproductive justice is for everyone, because everyone has the human right to decide if they're going to have a child, if they're not going to have a child, and to have safe and healthy conditions under which to raise their children. That's the core definition of reproductive justice, and that applies to everyone. But we don't like people co-opting the term without acknowledging its black feminist origins.
How have you seen, since 1994, I call it the misappropriation of not only the term reproductive justice, but also the original intent? Have you seen any evidence where the co-opting has assisted the initial intent to get reproductive rights for all?
Well, of course, everything takes place in a neoliberal context in which we are embedded. And so there is an attempt to create it as a marketing brand without necessarily looking at the substance of what is intended. There is an attempt to erase the specific contributions of black women by using a more euphemistic. Women of color created this term. Yes, black women are women of color, but it wasn't all women of color who did this. It was 12 black women. So there's an anti-black racism in that erasure that we have to call attention to. But the most difficult thing that we have to deal with are two. First of all, it is an intersectional approach to reproductive politics. So you have to include issues of race, class, gender, sexual identity, sexual preference, all kinds of things in a reproductive justice analysis. Yet intersectionality is our process. Human rights are our goal. You know, you use intersectionality to find out who you are. Because who you are determines what you need from human rights.
Can you talk a little bit about structural competence and its relationship to reproductive justice and cultural competence?
Well, I borrowed the term structural competence from the public health field because they have said we need to go beyond cultural competence, which is basically a savior kind of orientation that let's save these poor people of color by learning about their culture and learning about their languages, and we can deliver better service to them. What that admits is that you're not learning about your own blind spots. You're not learning about your structures that are in place to prevent true equity and equality and justice. And so you think that you're actually doing something good when you're structurally incompetent, when you're failing to note that you've not included any people of color in your deliberations or in your sites, or you fail to look at the role of white supremacy in contouring everything that you are discussing and trying to deliver. So I was very happy that the public health field created the concept of structural competence, and I now use it and invoke it in all of my writings because we have to make the invisible visible in order to achieve justice, and privilege invisibilizes itself over and over and over again, and the holders of that privilege will be the first to say they don't have it.
And so could you talk a little bit about how particularly you see science and technology and its relationship, good or bad, with reproductive justice?
Well, the first thing that I had to do as a STEM girl, of course, when I got into chemistry and physics in 1970, women at all were not welcome into the field, especially a black woman. So the barriers we had to encounter then are quite different, but in many ways the same way, the barriers that people encounter now. But the first thing I had to realize as a STEM person was the alleged objectivity of science is a myth. That every scientific idea, discovery, exploration takes place in a context of people's biases, people's expectations, their subjective interpretation of what the data means affects the science, and who the science benefits and who the science leaves out. And so that's when the two parts of my soul came together, when I finally realized that we actually, from our subjective lived experience, could critique the alleged objectivity and neutrality of science. And so that led me into exploring when science has been misused to reinforce inequalities, when science has been appropriated to make sure that we concretize things that should not be concretized, like the alleged genetic inferiority of people of color and things like that, like the bell curve school and those things. We really had to understand that scientific rigor requires accounting for all factors, not just selecting the factors that favor the conclusions you've already reached. You know, you don't make up what you believe and then find the facts to support it. That is not the scientific method. You do it the other way around.
Yeah.
And so that's where my feminist soul and my chemist soul came together, when I understood that I don't have to take this stuff that's presented to me as incontrovertible fact. Yes, there's something incontrovertible about mathematics and calculus and things like that, but what the data means is always subjected to human interpretation.
I see, I just love to hear your insight about how you perceive bringing together your work with white supremacy and reproductive justice in the interpretation of the Lack's account.
I think our scientific advancements, particularly around reproductive technologies, are having a couple of consequences that we're not necessarily prepared for. First of all, we're changing the definition of who is human. And we need to have some moral guidance to that, not just scientific development unfettered. Secondly, we're changing the definition of who owns their own body with the patenting of DNA and the scientific advancements like the Hilo strain that they use from Henrietta Lacks. So we're changing who owns humanity with our science. And we're recontouring the human family with these genetic modifications that are now becoming inheritable. We're changing what their family looks like and all of these things. As a reproductive justice activist, I think we should send out a big alarm bell, because all of these advancements are taking place in the same racist, nativist, white supremacist context, so that the people who are gene rich and can't afford these developments will be pitted against the naturals who can't afford these developments. And it may come to a point where the two populations won't even interbreed anymore, that they will end up as two separate populations. Now is the time for us to say, whoa, what do we want our future to look like? And is it the power of money decides who is a human being?
Wow, well, on that note, I have nothing more to say. This is phenomenal.